type it in right there. So it looks like we have participants calling in from quite a few different time zones. So wherever you're calling in from, thank you for joining us today for this session, Water Replenishment, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, brought to you by the Nature Conservancy, LimnoTech, the Coca-Cola Company, Blue Risk, AB InBev, Cargill, and Amazon Web Services. We are very excited to have you all on the line and are looking forward to a great conversation. Let's get started. So my name is Michael Matisich. I'm the Corporate Strategy Associate focusing on global water security at the Nature Conservancy, calling in today from California. We have 3 objectives for today's session on water replenishment. The first is to establish a common understanding of water replenish targets. Second is to create awareness about existing tools and approaches that help support the delivery of quality projects and consistency and benefit accounting. And the third objective is to identify gaps and challenges that need to be addressed by practitioners in the years ahead. So we brought in representatives from a variety of companies to share their thoughts and perspectives with you all on water replenishment, but we also look forward to getting everyone's feedback and opinions. So please feel free to type any questions or comments you have in the chat throughout the session. So looking at this agenda here for today, we'll kick things off with an overview of water replenishment, and we will then move to our panel discussion featuring the participants you see here. But before we begin, we'd like to poll the audience to get a sense of everyone's familiarity with replenishment. So if you move over to the right of your screen, you will see a polls tab. Click on that and you should see the first poll question that you can answer. So have you heard of replenish or replenishment, and or have you used this approach in your work? So again, it's in the Pathable page, the poll tab on your right. You guys a couple more seconds to answer. So it looks like the overwhelming majority have heard of replenishment. About 81% is aware of replenishment and applying it in your work. 13% is aware, but have not yet applied it in your work. And 6% so far have said no, they have not heard of replenishment, but looking forward to learning about it today. So let's go ahead and dive into the session. I'd like to introduce Laura Weintraub, Associate Vice President at LimnoTech, who will be providing an overview of Replenish. As many of you may know, LimnoTech is an environmental science and engineering firm providing water-related services to clients. LimnoTech has been doing Replenish for over 10 years and is one of the main authors of the Volumetric Water Benefit Accounting Guide. We will have a couple of minutes for Q&A after Laura's presentation, so please type your questions into the chat as they come up. Thank you for joining us today, Laura, and welcome. Please take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. I'm looking forward to setting the stage for this session on Replenish. Next slide. So I was excited to see in the poll that there's a lot of familiarity with Replenish, but I do want to just give a brief overview on the concept to make sure we're all on the same page. So some companies are making water stewardship commitments that focus on setting targets to balance their water consumption through watershed and community investments outside their operational boundaries. Demonstration towards these targets is typically achieved through projects that yield a volumetric benefit to water. The photos at the top of the screen are some examples of water replenish projects, such as reforestation, irrigation efficiency improvements, improved water access or sanitation, and wetland restoration, just to name a few. So here's a foundational definition of what is a volumetric water benefit. The 2 key parts to this definition I want to point out is that these projects help modify hydrology in a beneficial way, and that they can also help reduce shared water challenges. It's important to note that the concept of replenish is evolving beyond just volumetric benefits, and we're going to be getting into that discussion quite a bit today. 2 other quick important points on scope of a typical replenish program. And the first is that projects are typically have material connection to a site's water supply or wastewater discharge, and replenish projects are most often implemented outside the fence of an operational boundary of a company. So they're not internal efficiency projects. Next slide. The origins of Replenish and water stewardship in general are illustrated on this timeline. Prior to about 2008, there were primarily regulatory drivers for water. Companies were focusing on operational water management and in particular compliance with water-related regulations. And then a shift happened. And this was towards more voluntary actions in response to water conflict and reputational risk. CocaCola, who we have on the panel today, they were first to set a water balance goal, and many companies have followed. And now the ambitions of companies have been elevating beyond just volumes. And again, like I said, we're going to talk more about that in a bit. Next slide. So why replenish? Let's talk about the good. First of all, water balance targets are fundamentally simple. They provide a specific numeric KPI, and that can be tracked. Also, replenish helps incentivize good water management. The more efficient a company is, the lower the target is that needs to be achieved. But what I think is really exciting is that replenish helps incentivize action outside the fence line. Replenish programs can help address risk, including reputational risk, and successful replenish projects are often really good stories to tell. Finally, we know that water is complicated. It's local. It's much different than carbon. Balanced targets and replenish projects can be a simplified way for companies to start to communicate about water. Next slide. So the early years. Now some observations on that. Food and beverage companies were the leaders and very catalytic in this space. Initially, their primary focus was on replenishing operational volumes, not focusing on the supply chain water footprint, which can be a significant volume of overall water use. Also, companies were generally setting goals from a global perspective rather than focusing on priority basins. And early on, replenish projects were not necessarily located within a company's water supply watersheds. In the early years, there were definitely some challenges to overcome. One was to determine what activities count as a replenish activity. And secondly, what is an appropriate methodology to quantify the volumetrics associated with a wetland restoration or irrigation efficiency improvement or whatever the project might be. So as Michael mentioned at Limnotech, we were thrilled to be part of the effort to pioneer these methodologies to help meet these challenges. Next slide. This impact pathway helps illustrate the flow of this process from investments or inputs into water stewardship activities on the ground, and then towards outputs. Go ahead and give it a click. And that volumetric benefit is that output step. Now, what you see is that red arrow. What we really want to do is move the needle towards further to the right, towards outcomes and impacts. And those are ways that we'll be able to increase the movement towards this process to see improvements in things like healthier communities, improved biodiversity, and increased resilience. Volumetric benefits are an important output, but there's a strong interest to determine what is the desired watershed condition we're striving for, and how do we capture the benefits through these indicators that go beyond volumes. The good news is context-based targets and science-based targets are helping move us in this direction. Next. As I mentioned, Limnotech has been in the trenches, working with a number of companies to help implement their water replenish programs, and a few thoughts on best practices that we've observed. First of all, context is key. It's really important to prioritize where it matters in terms of risk and impact. Secondly, it's important to use consistent criteria to help screen and select projects. Criteria could be providing material connection, a good return on investment, a favorable timeline, and reputable partners. But companies should really avoid the tendency to chase drops and only go for those big volume projects. Yes, achieving a water balance target will require projects with a quantifiable volumetric benefit, and that could be something that's just really an important ambition. But be careful not to overlook other good projects that may not have a volume focus, but provide other important values such as community, water quality, or ecosystem benefits. Also, when quantifying benefits, it's important to pick the correct indicator and method. And that's kind of illustrated in this output from the VWBA methodology. For example, one wetland project may provide a primary benefit of recharging aquifers, where a different wetland project might provide the primary benefit of improving habitat. So those are different intents of the project, and different quantification methods should be used in those two cases. It's also important to consider programmatic elements, such as how to appropriately allocate benefits if there's multiple funders, what is the appropriate timing and duration of claiming those benefits, and making sure there's accurate record keeping and tracking of projects. Next slide. So how has Replenish evolved since the early years? These are the four pieces that came to mind for me. The first is capacity building, which is really exciting. We've seen an increase in the number and diversity of companies that are working in the Replenish space. Beyond food and beverage, the tech sector, manufacturing, agriculture, hospitality, retail, just to name a few. Also, there's been significant growth in the NGO community to understand the concept of Replenish and help develop stronger partnerships and really get those projects funded in the ground. With the VWBA methodology, we now have a more standardized approach to quantifying these Replenish project benefits, and I think that's been a great addition. With respect to context, we're seeing strong trends, how companies are now implementing projects in local or water supply watersheds, putting more focus on high water risk locations, and really thinking about what are the shared water challenges and connecting projects to what those challenges are. And then finally, collective action, another word we've heard a lot this week. There's a lot of collaborative platforms evolving that are going to help facilitate companies and NGOs to work together. The California Water Action Collaborative and the Texas Water Action Collaborative are just two examples. Next slide. So what are some lessons learned and challenges? I guess this is the bad and the ugly, though, that I'll speak to for a minute. Some have reflected on that the concept of replenish is inadequate when you only focus on operational water use, volumes only, and companies should really be considering the benefits beyond volumes. Also, there is a need to invest time and resources, especially to form strong partnerships. Many companies are active in the replenish space, and it sometimes can be hard to find that sweet spot project with a good return on investment, material connection, especially in high water risk areas. There's also a need to make sure projects are functioning to confidently claim a benefit. And verification and reporting might require monitoring, and companies don't often set money aside for this piece. Finally, there's more to water stewardship commitment than replenish. It does help catalyze action to do good work and have a positive impact, but we all know there's more to do. Last slide. So what's on the horizon? Well, I think the future is bright. There's a lot of good things to talk about here, and I know the panelists will help us elaborate. First of all, thinking towards more standardized guidance for implementing replenish programs. New tools are in the works to help streamline benefit calculations. We're hearing this week, and there's a lot of companies taking ambitious steps towards commitments with net positive water impact and science-based targets. They're going beyond volumetric balance targets and taking a more holistic approach. And I think we're in a good shape to help align replenish with these ambitious efforts. Also, companies are doing more work in their value chain, and replenish can and should extend into this scope. Two big areas of action are increasing nature-based solutions and considering how to quantify the multiple benefits from nature-based solutions. Perhaps you heard a session just prior to this, quantifying and focus on benefit quantification of NBS. If not, I suggest you give it a listen. Finally, there's growing momentum around fostering more collaboration, particularly in high-risk watersheds. So there was a lot to cover to set the stage, but I hope it helps frame some good conversation. And now I'm excited to take any questions and then pass things over to Paul Rieg.
Great, thank you for that great overview of Replenish, Laura. You provide some great best practices in there and gave us an exciting preview of what's to come for Replenish. We don't have any questions yet. If anyone has one, please go ahead and type them in now. I'll give you guys a few seconds or so if you didn't get the chance to do that yet. But if you think of any in the next 30, 45 minutes or so, go ahead and just type them into the chat, and Laura can try and respond via chat if we don't get to them right now. It looks like we have one from Cora. So water replenishment targets are somewhat modeled on carbon offsets. Do you anticipate they will continue down that path, for example, towards different scope levels or third-party verification? What would be the benefits or downsides of that?
So I do think that certainly different scope levels is an important element, thinking about value chain projects, and in particular where there's companies that are perhaps investing in a project where they have overlapping inventories in the same value chain. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I think we might need to think more creatively about how to quantify those benefits when we know there's some overlap between inventories. So I think that could be an interesting development to be determined. Third-party verification. Yeah, I think this is something we're hearing a lot about, that there's a need for companies to feel confident that the way the benefit quantification is being done is consistent. And as you know, Limnotech plays a role in that. And I think having more discrete methodologies on how to do that for other things besides volume is going to be quite important. So I think there are benefits as far as confidence and in going down that route. As far as downside, I think it's another step to take, and investment will need to be done to make sure we have those methods in place and that we have the framework and the right parties that can play that role. And I welcome others to jump in on if they have thoughts on that question too, either now or later in the panel.
Any thoughts from anyone else?
Yeah, hi everyone. This is Sammy Farbach from AB InBev. I'll be part of the panel in a few minutes. Really great to be here, and thanks for the presentation, Laura. I mean, I think it's an interesting question, particularly on the point of offsets and some of the challenges that we're seeing in that space, particularly in the face of climate change and wildfires, and where investments and offsets have been made and whether those are coming to fruition in terms of the benefits that we're seeing. And so I do think perhaps in water, we have the benefit of learning lessons from that space in terms of carbon emissions and, you know, the value of doing absolute reductions in your emissions as a company versus going about it in an offsets way. So I think it's a great point to raise in terms of keeping an eye on this space and what we're learning as climate change continues.
Thank you for that, Sammy. We do have one more question. So the question is, with the rise in interest in replenishment, can we expect more investment in monitoring? So the context is targets are based on calculation, often with simplifying if transparent assumptions. But as we are seeing with carbon offsets, monitoring sometimes presents a different story in terms of efficacy.
I think in general, there is a trend towards more monitoring that will occur, and I think it is a good step. I was on a panel or a roundtable earlier today focused on the tech sector and what role that sector can play to help really further this gap and provide tools that will make monitoring more affordable, more practical, and easier. I do think there can be some transparency challenges with that. As far as how the outcomes are shared across different organizations investing in projects. So I think as Sammy had pointed to, I think we can learn from the carbon space, but perhaps proceed with some caution to make sure that we're stepping at the right pace so that we're not missing the fact that these good projects being implemented are providing benefits, even if that exact benefit can't be measured explicitly due to funds or technology.
Great. Well, thank you again, Laura, and thank you to those who asked questions. We're now going to shift gears to the panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's panel, Paul Rieg. Paul has been in the water stewardship space for over a decade. While working for the World Resources Institute, he led the development of the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas and the volumetric water benefit accounting method. He recently started his own consulting company, Blue Risk, which focuses on enhancing resilience and reducing risk in the face of emerging water challenges. Welcome, Paul, and thank you for joining and moderating today's discussion.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Michael. And thanks everyone for joining today. As Michael introduced, I'm going to serve as your moderator for the panel discussion. We've heard from Laura kind of the background on Replenish, how it's evolved over the years, from the voice of a practitioner that's been really in the trenches, as Laura, you said, helping companies. And now we're going to move to hear from companies, from practitioners. some of which have been in this space for a really long time, others that are joining now, and hear their views on the topic of replenishment. And the way we're going to do that is I'm going to put out a question, then we're going to go one by one, and the panelists will answer the questions. And then after that, all of you participants here will have plenty of time to submit your questions and ask directly to the panelists. So we have 4 panelists, 4 companies, different sectors, and all of them engaged all over the world in water stewardship activities. So this is a really unique opportunity to hear directly from those that are boots on the ground making things happen. So we have John Radke from CocaCola, we have Truca Smore from Cargill, we have Sammy Farbach from Anheuser-Busch InBev, and we have Will Hughes from Amazon Web Services. Thank you to the 4 panelists for joining. I'm going to state the questions, and then we're going to go in that order. We're going to start with John, and then Truca, then Sammy, and then Will. Each of you try to keep your comments to around 3 to 4 minutes if you can, and then we'll open it up first for any reactions amongst the panelists and then to the participants. So the questions are, if you can please introduce yourselves, name and affiliation, although I just said that, so maybe we can skip that. And we can go right into, whether or not your organization has a replenish type commitment in place and how you landed on making that decision as an organization, what was involved in deciding that. And then briefly, what you think is one of the bigger strengths of replenish type commitments, and then maybe a weakness of commitments related to replenish. So those 3 things. And again, yeah, if you could keep it into 3 or 4 minutes, that'd be fantastic. So over to you, John. Do you want to kick us off?
All right, thanks, Paul.
Yep.
And hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for joining. As Paul said, I work for CocaCola. I actually lead our water and agricultural sustainability program in North America. So first question was, do we have a replenish program? And the answer is yes, we do. And we've actually had one since 2008. I actually was around at the time whenever we came up with that concept. So I know that does kind of age me, but so be it. Anyway, at the time, we were facing reputational challenges, for our water use, which soon turned into real material challenges for being able to access water in some areas. And we had already started doing global water risk assessments by that time and had identified it in our 10K disclosure, our risk report for investors. And so it was on our radar. And we had been working on water efficiency inside the plant for quite a while, but we realized that we need to think outside the box, or in this case, outside of the 4 walls of our operations. And we wanted to come up with a really big, bold target to address some of the issues we were having. At the time, carbon neutrality was kind of a thing. And so there was a lot of talk in our organization about, okay, why not try to go for water neutrality? A lot of the people who were coming up with that didn't fully understand, how water is so local and how different it is from carbon. But anyway, the concept was a good idea. And we understood, that our water that we use in our plants came from watersheds. Also, the same watersheds, provided water for the communities that we operated in, that we serve. So we figured that's a good place to focus our replenishment efforts. So at the time, we set this goal to return to communities and nature the same amount of water that we use in our beverages and their production. Then we figured out we had to decide how in the world we're going to do this. We worked with Brian Richter from the Nature Conservancy at the time, and also Limnotech, to figure out how we can quantify these projects into gallons or liters of water. And it was a bodacious goal to start with. We weren't sure if we could even do it. Was it possible? But we soon found out that it was, and we actually achieved it. It was a 2020 goal, and we achieved it 5 years early in 2015. So now, biggest strengths and weaknesses. Replenish sometimes gets a bad rap, but there are a lot of good things that came out of it. Setting quantifiable goals really drives investment from our company. Whenever you set a goal, then there's usually going to be some money following that to try to achieve it. Also, when you announce something globally, publicly, that gets your leadership's attention, and then they start driving it too, and which is just really imperative if you're going to meet a goal. I like the way we set it up originally because it is quantifiable and you can track progress, see how you're coming along. A couple other things that really were benefits were working with NGOs, and we hadn't done much of that in the past. So we figured out how they work, they figured out how we work, and you look for those common areas, you know, around watersheds. So they cared about animals, we cared about beverages, but we all cared about watersheds. And then the projects are really rewarding and inspiring, especially if you go on the ground and see them and see the impacts they're having on the local habitats or local communities. And it makes you feel good. And it's you know, makes you feel good about working for a company that does that. So those are some of the big strengths, and really quickly the weaknesses. Laura did a great job of kind of outlining many of those, which we have also realized along our journey. The main one being, you know, we do all these replenish projects all over the world, but are they really moving the needle on water security or watershed health, you know, across the whole watershed? And we'd probably have to say the answer is no, not just on the work that we've done alone. So, you know, we're working on new goals and we've already established them, and it's really focused on collective action. We're also focusing on specifically the water stressed areas, where we source our water from. In the past, it was more of a general global goal. So, you know, we definitely identified the weaknesses, and you heard about a lot of them, but I think we're going in the right direction now. So I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. Thanks, John. Truca.
Yes, happy to give my view on the perspective. So I'm Truca Smoor from Cargill. And like John said, like Cargill also has replenishment targets, but they are really embedded into our overall strategy, water strategy, and sustainable ambition to achieve sustainable water management. So when we talk about sustainable water management, basically what that brings down to is to say, how can we balance our water use in those areas where it's needed most? So that gets to how we actually arrived at these targets that we have set, which are about balancing our impact where it's needed most, driving the change where it's needed most. It's runs down to basically 4 questions, but then asking those questions again and again and again. It starts with, well, what's the issue? Because, like, as Laura said, like, water is complex. Is it about availability? Is it about quality? Is it about the access to safe drinking water? Is it about governance? Is it about infrastructure? And I really look at, like, can I get in directional feel for what is the issue? And then how is it going to impact me? This is where your risk assessment fits in. And then the next step is, well, how am I contributing to it? Is it something I can influence? And then last, but most important question is, like, how can I drive meaningful change? And I think that question often gets forgotten because we think about, like, okay, we have to set these targets, we have to solve these issues, but connecting it really to what you can do as a company, but also where you have the impact, has become really powerful for Cargill, and has been the way of how we've convinced our teams, whether it's up or down in the organization, to say this is the right approach. Because through focusing on where it's needed most, you can prioritize your action. And then the moment that you do the exact same exercise when you're looking at an agricultural supply chain in Mexico or a water quality issue in Europe, you immediately can get to the discussion to things that they recognize. It says, like, well, it's about water availability, and it's about my agricultural supply chain. It's about connecting with farmers, because that's where I can drive change. And I think it's that part that has really worked for us and brought it down to say, we need these type of targets to drive meaningful change where it's needed most. If you look at the strengths of replenishment targets, the key piece there is really, like, I think many of us here in the room who have been working on water, I think all of us realize, like, with the reduce, reuse, recycle, just focusing on your own operations, yes, it's needed. Yes, you have to do that, but you're not going to solve the issues that we're facing. Replenishment targets allow you to look at what can be done in the local context. And quite often, there's a lot more meaningful change you can arrive by looking at what is needed in the watershed context. Is it about like my stakeholders? Is it about nature-based solutions? Is it about my community? And by taking that lens, it allows you to really drive change beyond what you can achieve with just focusing on your operations. If you look at weaknesses, I think initially, and I think this is also very much kind of the evolving topic that Laura was speaking to, is like initially there was a lot of focus on quantity, on volumes, and like really focused on water scarcity. And water is just so much more. Like sometimes it's not about water scarcity, it's about like how can we drive quality issues, or how can we drive infrastructure, or how can we drive governance, and going beyond that area and looking at how can we extend it. And again, and in the same way, extending it to beyond not only your operational footprint, because for many companies, not for all companies, but for many sectors, we see, and especially for our sector in like food, beverage, and agriculture, you see that the impact is in your value chain, or in our case, in our agricultural supply chain. So connecting replenishment targets or restoration targets, quantitative targets, to where your impact is across the value chain is I think, a really important next step. It also gets to, I think, the next step of evolving, say, what's enough? Like, what can we do? What do we have to do? But also, how can we do it in the right way? And because I feel like every company who cares about water, who has that impact, who face these issues, struggles with, like, how can we get this right? Because it is so complex. And what is good enough? Because we want to do our part, but we cannot do it alone. Even a company the size of Cargill, yes, we want to truly make a difference. We have set very ambitious targets and we want to achieve those, but we cannot do it alone. So it's the struggle of what can we do together, and how can we let it together be enough? And I think that's where we have to work towards, which again makes the point of, can we standardize this? Can we get to standardized methods of net positive impact, science-based targets?
Thank you.
I will leave it with that, but it's an exciting topic. Don't get me started.
Exciting topic and excellent contribution. So thank you. Really good. So just a heads up on time, we have about eight minutes left, I think, for panel. But so Sammy and then Will.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Once again, I'm Sammy Farbach, Global Director for Water and Sustainability Operations at Anheuser-Busch InBev. I'm based out of New York. And a lot of what John and Truca has said already resonates. We've been on similar water journeys as a company, first looking mostly inward at our own operational water use efficiency. But as we've turned our vision outward, we've arrived as a company, I think, at a slightly different place. We launched our most recent set of sustainability goals in 2018, and our commitment on water stewardship is that by 2025, 100% of the communities where we operate facing water stress will have measurable improvement in water availability and quality. So we don't have an explicit replenishment commitment, and that is deliberate for us. We know that water challenges are hyperlocal. I think that's been brought up. And so, our view is that there isn't sort of a one-size-fits-all solution that can be implemented everywhere. We've developed a 7-step watershed management process that we're implementing in each of our priority watersheds. And the process isn't rocket science, but it's really helped us drive action at the local level. It starts with stakeholder engagement and outreach, really understanding what the specific water problems and challenges are in the watershed, and then what are potential solutions really tailored to those challenges. And once the solutions are agreed with the stakeholders, then we move on to implementation and establishing governance and financing mechanisms and communicating our progress, and then finally monitoring and measuring our impact on water availability and quality. So the water solutions that we implement and what we measure and what we work towards at each of our priority watersheds really depends on and starts with what are the specific issues in that community and in that watershed, and where it makes sense based on the local challenges. Those activities for us sometimes do include replenishment work, but we don't start with replenishment automatically, and we don't feel that replenishment is always the solution that will drive meaningful impact. So, for example, if the main challenges in a community, as I think Truca was saying, is poor water quality, water replenishment efforts won't necessarily solve that problem. And our focus has been on, driving measurable improvement on the specific water challenges that our communities are facing where we operate. think in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, on the strength side, I think, they've been touched on already, and water is really complex, and replenishment is a simple concept, and there's definitely value and power in simplicity. I think, when things are easy to understand, I think John said this, it's much easier to get buy-in from stakeholders, particularly company leadership, and other stakeholders that maybe don't have as much water expertise, and that's important. You need to get that buy-in to get out of the gate. But I think that there's a real risk with starting with replenishment in terms of potentially driving the wrong behavior within the company for a given watershed, or at least driving a somewhat narrow set of actions. And I think it really depends on how a company arrives at their replenishment objective. So we think about two scenarios. One, a company takes a bit of a top-down approach and they want to offset 100% of their water use. That might lead them to say, let's go find 2 basins, and sort of whatever the challenges are, we're going to offset 60% of our water use in this basin and 40% in another one. In the second scenario, the company may start with this idea, we have these high-risk watersheds and we want to do meaningful work in them, whatever that may be. When they look at the challenges in that watershed, replenishment efforts do appear to be the right solution for driving the improvements that are needed. And the end result is sort of, the same in terms of offsetting its water use, but it's a more bottom-up approach. And I think the impact is very different and sort of much better in that second scenario, in my view. I think if you do what's needed in a watershed and find a way of quantifying that work, and it adds up to some percent or 100% or even more of your operational water use, and you want to communicate it, that's great because you've addressed the needs of the watershed. But I think there's a risk with starting with replenishment that all you're kind of doing is taking your own challenges as a company and sort of transposing them onto the needs of the community, and not necessarily doing what's needed depending on the situation. So as I said, we do replenishment work. It's just, it's where it matters in the specific watershed. I think I'll leave it there because I know we're kind of running low on time.
Great contributions. Thank you, Sammy. We'll come back to that. Will.
Yeah, so Will Hughes, I'm with Amazon Web Services. I lead our global water sustainability program. First off, folks, you may not understand why Amazon Web Services is thinking about water. Amazon Web Services is the data center side of Amazon, and in a lot of our data centers, we use water for cooling. It helps us dramatically decrease the amount of energy that we need for the data centers, which in turn has knock-on water savings. But we're trying to optimize both of the energy and the water and minimize our impacts on both of those resources. And so we are thinking about water replenishment, or maybe a little bit earlier in our journey than some of these other companies. We don't have specific global targets yet. But we're doing a lot of work to switch our data centers to recycled water wherever possible as an input. We are globally looking at how we can improve water use efficiency. In some of our locations, we're directly providing our cooling water discharge from our data centers to farmers for use in irrigation, where it gets to a point where it doesn't work for our cooling, but it's still very safe and clean water and other uses. And then we're also looking at how we can support projects within communities to make sure that we're having a positive impact on water availability and water quality wherever we're operating. I think the strength of a commitment of a global target, I think of it largely from an internal perspective. And a lot of big companies, water is not necessarily top of mind for a lot of people, and it takes a lot of education to communicate to leadership why water is an important area to focus on. And setting a target really helps to bring the resources and bring focus to a challenge. And once people get hooked on water, there's a lot of, I feel like everyone gets it, but it takes some education, and setting a target can be really helpful to align those internal resources. I think another, well-designed program can also help not just bring money to projects within communities, but to also think about, well, what can we do differently? How can we drive innovation? And how can we use our particular company's expertise to advance the sector overall. So Amazon Web Services has a lot of digital water tools that can really help water utilities or nonprofits better target their projects or find where leakages within their systems. How can we bring that expertise and those tools in a way that complements what we're good at, while also helping communities drive long-term water sustainability? I think that can be a strength of a program, of a well-designed program, and to not just settle for cutting checks for, you know, conservation projects, but also to say, how can we take the next step? How can we push towards performance-based approaches? How can we, you know, leverage the funding that we have available to do more than just improve water sustainability in one area? So I think those can be strengths in a well thought out program. Weaknesses, I think folks have touched on those. It really depends on how you design the program. I think it can lend itself, those targets, towards a bean counting kind of accounting approach if you're not careful. But I think a lot of folks have mentioned thoughtful ways that you can get around that and go where the need is, and think beyond kind of those some of those pitfalls. And I'll stop there.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. So before we go to participants on the line, I wanted to offer our panelists an opportunity to share any reactions or comments to what other panelists said. Do any of you want to share any reflections before we go to the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Paul.
Yeah.
You know, I think one thing that does, you know, excite me is hearing this sort of collective growing focus on watershed health and really trying to solve the problems in our watershed, and recognition that that's kind of where our focus needs to be if we want to move the needle on water risk for both our businesses and for the community. I know in his intro of you, Michael mentioned that you were sort of very instrumental in the development of Aqueduct. And I think we're seeing that how water risk looks in the future isn't really changing. And if anything, it's getting worse. Now, of course, there's climate change and broader things at play, but I think it's just, you know, I'd love to see, you know, all of us really rallying around this idea of watershed health as kind of like the real sort of starting point and you know, center of where we need to be.
Great. So maybe just building on that, Simon, we have a question from the audience around how is AB InBev measuring success towards your water goal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, you know, that 7-step watershed management process I mentioned, that a key part of that is once you've identified kind of what the problem is and the solution you're going to implement, is thinking through, okay, then what is the KPI or KPIs that are going to be an indicator of the actual sort of measurable impact that we're going to have in that space. And so it is more complex and perhaps more challenging because we go sort of site to site and watershed to watershed to do that approach and determine what exactly we're going to be measuring. As a bit of a teaser, we're excited to be soon releasing a guide we put together with the Nature Conservancy, sort of demystifying the process on measurement and evaluation of watershed programs to really drive impact. And it really provides sort of a step-by-step guide on how to do that. And I think the key thing is having measurement of impact in mind from the very beginning of when you establish your program and establish those projects, and building those plans in with your implementing partners from the get-go and being clear on where you're trying to get to based on what the problem is.
Great. Yeah.
I have a comment, Paul.
Yeah, jump right in.
Yeah, so replenishment, you know, in and of itself is not the answer, and it shouldn't be your water strategy, but I think it is a really valuable component of a strategy. And I see, you know, I work in a lot of collaboratives and work with a lot of companies and groups focused on certain geographies. And man, it moves pretty slow a lot of times. And everybody says, oh yeah, we want to, you know, improve the health of this giant watershed. I mean, and it could take years and years and years and years. In the meantime, you know, I say, let's start finding some good, meaningful replenish projects that are starting to address those issues, you know, and then you can quantify them. And so, you know, I think that it's an important component of a strategy, but there's got to be a lot more to it, as Sammy was talking about, you know, and your ultimate goal is to improve the health and the water security. And there's other things you got to deal with in addition to replenish. But you know, it's a good place to show some progress as you're working towards that greater goal.
Yeah, and I think I very much can connect to that, because I think one of the things I hear throughout like all the different stories, but also like keeping an eye on some of the questions that have been asked. Like one of the things we see with as replenishment has evolved today, I believe it's no longer just about replenishment. I think that's what all of us have said is it's like it's about like addressing water in its watershed context and identifying what the issue is in that context, and then looking at how can we contribute in that. And then ideally, or maybe not ideally, but like setting targets, though that's a choice you have to say, is like, can I connect targets to that to actually measure how we're getting there? And I think that is this common thread, that it's no longer about just replenishment. It's not about like giving water back to the aquifer. It's about like addressing the water issue in that context, whether it's like replenishment is just one of the many issues that we can address as part of that.
That's right. Great. Just a reminder I saw a few panelists have their hand up. Make sure you submit your questions through the chat function. In the meantime, maybe one follow-up question to a point that Laura raised around the challenges with incentivizing, if you have a replenish program, incentivizing lower volume projects or projects that are catalytic in nature, right, that are going to drive really long-term impacts in a basin, drive watershed health, but short-term don't provide those volumes. Do any of you have experience working internally with your stakeholders to get around those challenges and really incentivizing that longer-term thinking?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a quick response around that. Like, so one way we've approached that is when we looked at our targets, like the restoration target or the reduction of pollutants targets, those are targets for 2030. And one of our very important internal metrics that we consistently track for any of these projects is what are the sustained benefits that we can achieve by 2030. So it's not about like what will we achieve this coming year or even the next 2 years, but over the next 10 years, if a project doesn't have a sustained outcome by 2030, it won't even count towards our target. So with that, it forces you to just say, it's like, we should not come with short-term solutions. We have to identify solutions that either create intrinsic value for all the stakeholders so that they will keep doing it no matter what, or you have to find solutions that are quite often things like native basins, like wetland restorations, or natural aquifer recharge that will just stay there and keep going. So that has been our approach towards them.
John?
I can give just a quick example where we've invested in, well, one was a irrigation efficiency improvement project, and they just didn't know if the irrigators were going to buy off on it and implement this broadly. And they said, well, it's going to cost money and we're going to do it as a pilot, but there's no guarantees that they're going to keep doing it or anything like that. And we did it and we invested in it, and then they loved it. And within a year, a whole bunch of people adopted it. And pretty soon, you know, it was really, you could really see the difference in the river there. Another one is on-farm recharge in California, you know, and they're trying to replenish those aquifers. And in our minds, we could see long-term, you can't just take, you know, farmland out of production and make a big groundwater recharge basin and do that everywhere, because, you know, you need to have productive farmland. So then this study was around flooding these orchards during the dormant season, and can you put a lot of water on there, let it soak in and not harm those trees or the crops. And so, you know, we invested in some of these pilots to see if it is possible without getting any replenish benefits, but knowing that if this is successful, that's the way to really solve some of the problems in Central Valley of California. So I would say, yes, there are opportunities to do that.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I think it's the project risk that you're willing to take is often related to the risk that you're facing in that basin, or kind of the potential for innovation on that project. So if you say, look, we know we have a big water related risk here, and this is going to take a longer time for us to figure out how to address it, or this is a really innovative solution that we think is going to move the whole sector forward, it makes more sense to put some development capital or, some invest in some higher risk projects if that helps move the needle on either of those metrics for you internally.
Great suggestions. I still see some hands up from participants. Again, if you want to weigh in, I think the best way is going to be through the chat function. In the meantime, let's see. No more questions came in since the last one. I can go ahead with another question that I have a few, but panel or participants, please weigh in the chat function. We're eager to hear your comments. One question for me is on the importance of engaging stakeholders at different scales, globally, peers, but also regionally, but also locally at the project level. And yeah, just how have you gone about embedding that notion of stakeholder engagement in these programs? And are there any tips that you might have for other companies that are thinking about goals or targets similar to these that relate to that stakeholder engagement component and its importance? Yeah,
thanks, Paul. I think that's a great question. And I think going back to the process that we follow AV InBev, the very first step is sort of convening and engaging stakeholders, because we really believe that if you don't start by sort of grounding yourself in what the community that sort of depends on a given watershed feels like the most pressing challenges are, I think you're going to not have the great outcomes that John mentioned, where people are really excited about it and potentially run the risk of, them not buying in and the solutions not being sustained. So I think it's an incredibly important place to start. And I do think you need to kind of be working at all those levels. I think at the local level, the key thing is engaging stakeholders to make sure your understanding of the greatest need and the greatest challenges are the same understanding as theirs. I think the benefit of engaging stakeholders at a regional level is, water is a shared resource, and I think there are a lot of lessons learned and best practices to be shared, across a province, a nation, a region of the world. And I think that, companies, particularly ones that are on this panel that are multinational, can really play a catalytic role in having that sort of higher level view of what's going on in different regions of the world and being able to connect players so they can learn from one another. And then I think globally, the water challenges that we're facing, and on a different panel I was on, someone said, we have multiple water crises happening, are much bigger than any of our one companies can tackle individually. And I really believe that collective action is the only way we're going to get to impact at scale that's needed. And so, we're a part of the Water Resilience Coalition. I know others on this panel are as well. And that global view of how we can work together to amplify our own impact and also be catalysts for change, I think, as Will was talking about, is critical at the global level as well.
Great input for all of you listening that are thinking about a Replenish program or water goal. John or Will or Truca, anything you want to add? We have one more minute.
I'll just add, thinking of the large scale stakeholders, global stakeholders, and then drilling all the way down to local. One example is one of our big partners is World Wildlife Fund, and they understand what our needs are in different areas of the world. And so we identified some watersheds we're interested in. Then they contacted the local stakeholders, like a TNC, Nature Conservancy chapter or something. And then they connected with local municipalities and local farmers. And through this global relationship, you're able to drill down, get with the local stakeholders, figure out what their needs are. And this one had to do with edge of field wetlands that treated the water as it's coming off, so that when it gets into the stream, it's not as high in nutrients. And then therefore the municipality doesn't have to spend as much money on their wastewater treatment system. Mm-hmm. And so everybody wins by these investments on the farm and working with these local stakeholders. But it's just an example of how, you can work at all those different levels of stakeholders.
Really good example. And I'm gonna stop here and hand it over to Andrea Erickson for some concluding remarks. That was a great panel discussion. I just saw one question come in, but we're gonna respond to that later. Sorry about that. And yeah, Andrea, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks everybody on the panel. These are fabulous, really fabulous practitioners, leaders in their companies in the field, and we owe them a lot for all the work they've done. Before I jump to any concluding remarks, we do have one more poll for you. So if you'll go back over to the Pathfinder screen and look on the poll tab, that second tab on the right-hand side, just take a moment here and just think about for yourself, what do you think the most important evolutions of replenishment are that have happened or need to happen? So I'll give you a moment to orient yourself and get over there on the Pathfinder tab for polls. And I guess just to finish up so we can finish on time, what I want to point out here is from our perspective in the Nature Conservancy, and I know this is a shared perspective with lots of other organizations that work with corporations, is that they are powerful primary actors in places across the globe where we will not be successful without them. And so the journey here is about figuring out how do we get to that final outcome. And I'm so pleased to hear in everybody's remarks that, you know, at the top of this, we're all about watershed health and the benefits that those positive functioning ecosystems can provide for people. So watershed health, water security for people, top line impacts that all of us are dedicated towards. And I think that's really the most important thing. There's a Zen Buddhism expression, don't mistake for the finger pointing at the moon for the moon. Like they're two different things. Watershed health and water security is our final destination, but we do need some direction on the pathway. We need to point somewhere. And so I think what's been really important here is there's been a deep evolution and acknowledgement of the things that were problematic about replenishment. We all sort of agree chasing drops is not a good idea. The multi-benefits of watershed health projects, you know, are really important to capture. So I think this group has already gone through really clearly the things that they self-identified as necessary adjustments, and those things are happening. I also think it's important that as we get that, you know, directional, where are we going to have common language when we meet each other in the field, in those watersheds, about what are those threats, what are the problems we're trying to solve here, and then what are some of the core processes that everybody agrees need doing. You know, we need baseline information, we need to engage with stakeholder, we need measures, there's a series of practices. I don't think we're, you know, wrong in any of those things, but I'm very compelled by the argument that we have to have a way to really drive investment. And if it takes having replenishment goals that are simple to communicate, to drive the corporate community to invest more, I'm all for it, with all the caveats that we talked about here. Because if we don't have sustained corporate support for these changes, at the end of the road, there will not be sustained investments in those watersheds that we care about. And so I think as a last thought, the thing that we're struggling with here is that balance between long-term sustained benefits that takes time. Freshwater systems take time, building capacity, building collaboration takes time. And yet these professionals are working in corporate environments where they have quarterly reports. And we have to find a way to work together to bridge those differences in time and duration to get there. And so if replenishment, finally done, finely tuned, helps drive that long-term corporate engagement and commitment at the table, I think that we're all better for it. So with that, I want to thank again these people. If they win, we win. If these corporations do the right thing on the planet in every corner where they work, watersheds and people will be better everywhere, far more than what we could do on our own. So I really appreciate your leadership, all of you. And everybody else who joined us, thank you for coming today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks
all.
everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.